Listening to Ms Ardern and Paula. Bennett has been our political commentator, Colin James, who is in our Wellington studio. Good morning, Colin.
Good morning, Rachel.
OK, let's look at perhaps the key element that's come out of this white paper. What do you make of the government's move to, in essence, narrow its focus? It's focusing on the most vulnerable, it says, the 20 or 30,000 children.
Yes, that's there's quite a lot to make of it. First of all, I can't see that many people would disagree with what the government's doing. This is pretty important stuff. The second point I'd make is that John Key has said to me on several occasions that he wants his legacy as Prime Minister to be what he does for disadvantaged children. And then that's a question of who qualifies there. And Jacinda Ardern's quite right. There's a much wider group that don't qualify. And the government, if you focus on the government's own comments about the number of kids who are leaving school illiterate, innumerate, not work-ready, that tells you there's a much wider group that you might want to take an interest in for our self-interest in the future workforce, in a more cohesive society and so on.
There's been some interesting commentary this week too, Colin, about child abuse that, you know, it's not just a family's problem or a suburb's problem, it's in everyone's interests in this country that children do well.
Yes, and Paula Bennett herself said that these are my kids, these are your kids. We have the power to protect it, let's use it. Now that, I think, draws a line through the Cabinet. There are people who believe that children belong to all of us. All children belong to all of us, and therefore all of us have a duty. And there are some people in the Cabinet who do believe that, and I think Paula Bennett is one. And there are those who prefer to see children as part of a family and you shouldn't interfere too much. And I think there's a tension in the Cabinet about that. I think there's tension in society about that the Cabinet is reflecting. And that's where Jacinda Ardern comes in, as the degree to which the Labor Party is prepared to take that first line rather than the second line. Now, it's quite interesting. She's talking about Minister for Children, and she's a spokesperson for children. But before the last election, the Labor Party had what they called a child-centred policy, which they made almost nothing of in the election campaign, and she didn't mention that again today. So that's interesting. I mean, just how far is the Labor Party prepared to go?
In the last 6 months or so, Colin, I think we've increasingly seen the mainstream media is picking up on these issues of the living wage and issues of poverty, etc. That's something we haven't seen a lot of historically. How do you think the government's responded to a shift, if you like, in the agenda?
Well, I think there is. I wouldn't want to overstate it, but I think there is beginnings of a shift in public attitude, and it's partly reflecting the mainstream media's shift as well. And let's take it a little bit wider. And Phil O'Reilly, who's Chief Executive of Business New Zealand, I wouldn't describe him as a mushy lefty. He's got involved in Every Child Counts. He got involved in the Children's Commissioner's Expert Advisory Group. Why? Because he sees it as a future workforce issue. You need all children up to scratch. They need to be able to get educable and work ready, etc. So I think there is a shift going on, and it's quite interesting. The government, I think, has actually got a bit edgy about it. Paula Bennett was very fluffy, shall we say, about what they might do about the final report from the Children's Commissioner. And we're seeing some nervousness in the Cabinet about just where the debate might be going.
Indeed, the other major political issue I think this week has been the GCSB. What do you make of the way the Labor Party, and in particular David Shearer, have revealed this information about a so-called leak?
I think there are two serious elements to it. One is that someone in the GCSB would leak. That is a serious matter. And the second is that a leader of the opposition who wants to be Prime Minister should use a leak from a security agency. A Prime Minister has to be very careful about security matters. If we want an example of that, Leon Panetta, who was here recently, said in the last few days that you could have a Pearl Harbor type effect done through cyber warfare, a sudden attack. Now, we need to be pretty careful about what's happened or is done in our security agencies, and a would-be Prime Minister ought to be extra careful.
It certainly hasn't been helpful what's been going on this week for National. Certainly John Key's been under the gun. Are we starting to see, do you think, David Shearer and the opposition party starting to potentially team up here?
There's been a little bit of that, and the way I would say it is that Labor and the Greens and New Zealand First are less unchummy than they were. And on Friday there was a demonstration by all three party leaders at the Engineering, Printing and Manufacturers Union's Jobs Summit to say that they would convene an inquiry, a parliamentary inquiry they're talking about. In other words, acting as an opposition. The importance of that is that if they can gradually over time present the appearance of a government in waiting, a coalition in waiting, that changes the factors in the 2014 election. In 2011, voters said couldn't see an alternative government. In 2014, if those three leaders can carry on working together, there might be an alternative government in waiting that voters can see, and that changes the game quite a lot. And with John Key not managing the politics, not managing the government all that well through this year, that also feeds in.
Indeed. Thank you very much for your time this morning, Colin James.
Morning.